The United States and the Taliban have signed an agreement aimed at ending nearly 2 decades of conflict in Afghanistan. Both sides inked the deal in Qatar's capital, Doha, following a year and a half of talks. Each have committed to a reduction in violence. The agreement paves the way for the United States to gradually withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. In return, the Taliban have promised not to allow the country to be used as a base for terrorist attacks against the West. Well, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo hailed the signing of the agreement in Doha. He called it the best opportunity for peace in a generation.
Today is an historic day for the United States of America and the American people. Today we have taken a decisive step toward peace. Real peace in Afghanistan. Just as any worthy journey begins, it is a first step, and we know exactly who we're dealing with. If the Taliban do not uphold their commitments, President Trump and his team will not hesitate to do what we must do to protect American lives. If, on the other hand, the Taliban abide by their promises, the United States will undertake a responsible, conditions-based troop withdrawal.
All right, for some analysis on all of this, I'm joined in the studio by DW's Sandra Petersman, who's been covering Afghanistan extensively for many years. Sandra, it's really great to have you here. So we just heard this clip from the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. I mean, he sounded sort of optimistic, but also very cautious. From your perspective, how significant is today's agreement? Is it really going to be a step towards peace?
I think it is a historic moment. It's a moment of hope, but we got to be careful because the real work still lies ahead, especially ahead of the Afghan people, because this is essentially an agreement between the United States, in extension NATO, and the Taliban. It doesn't involve the representatives of the Afghan people, the elected representatives of the Afghan people. It doesn't involve representatives of the civil society, of the people. And that is now the next big step. That is really something that needs to happen before anyone can call this an Afghan peace deal.
Well, just looking at the terms of this agreement, the United States says it's prepared to begin withdrawing its troops from Afghanistan. I mean, there's, what, like 12 or 13,000 U.S. troops there at the moment. But what sort of guarantees are the Taliban offering in exchange?
So at the moment, if we look at the roughly 12,000 U.S. troops plus some NATO troops on top of that, the reduction would be, according to the agreement, in the first 135 days, starting from today, down to 8,000. And then the Taliban, of course, need to give something. And they are saying, look, we break away from terror. Afghanistan will not be used as a safe haven by terrorists ever again to launch attacks on anyone. Plus, they basically admit to something that they have rejected all along, as sitting down with representatives of the new Afghanistan that was built while they were dealing with their insurgency.
Well, this insurgency has been going on for nearly 19 years, and that means an entire generation was born and reached adulthood in Afghanistan knowing nothing but war. Millions of children are deeply traumatized, but with today's agreement, many do have fresh hope that it could offer a chance to live their lives in peace. We now have this report on the impact of the Afghan conflict on young people.
13-year-old Hamidullah works as a shoe shiner instead of going to school. 11-year-old Sabir sells dried fruits on Kabul's streets. They're just two of the Afghan children who've been robbed of an education because of war. The U.S. military campaign in Afghanistan has now lasted for more than 18 years. Years without peace for the children who were born and grew up in the country.
Peace is like a dream to us in Afghanistan. If peace comes, we will be able to rebuild our economy through mining, for example, or business.
I'm imagining peace in a photo which is full of happiness, non-discrimination, and a photo which is full of happiness which comes from education. And a photo which is people are not blaming everything on each other.
For many Afghan children, the conflict has meant destruction and poverty. And the UN says child casualties increased sharply since 2015. That was when the Taliban started stepping up its attacks, seizing territory across the country. The re-energized insurgency coincided with Afghan forces taking over combat duties from foreign troops. Afghanistan will struggle to overcome its internal divisions, despite a peace deal between the US and the Taliban. That leaves the children whose lives have been ruined by war to face an adulthood also blighted by conflict.
So, as we saw in our report, it really has been civilians, and in particular young people in Afghanistan, who've been bearing the brunt of the conflict over nearly 2 decades. Sandra, where does today's agreement then leave the ordinary people in Afghanistan? How is this going to affect their day-to-day lives now?
Well, the past week saw a reduction of violence. That was the condition to have today's deal signed. So it can work. We saw that it can work because instead of having roughly 80 attacks per day countrywide, we saw less than 10 attacks per day, which is huge for the people who suffer the brunt of explosions, of suicide attacks, all of that, of aerial bombardments, of drone attacks. So nothing like that really happened on the scale like we used to see on a daily basis in Afghanistan. If this could continue, if this could gain momentum and maybe lead to a nationwide truce, and if we then see talks, people sitting down and really mapping out the future of Afghanistan, whether it's going to be an Islamic Emirate, which is what the Taliban want, or whether it's going to stay a republic, what I guess the political elite in Kabul wants, which is at loggerheads with each other, that remains to be seen. But at the moment, I think people really wish for the end of violence, at least that.
All right, DW's Sandra Petersman, always great to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you so much.